what I'd like to do is take a few minutes to discuss the topic, the title anyway, of Dr. Hubbard's talk, Is the Energy Crisis Contrived or Real? Now, what I got out of his presentation was that the energy crisis, and by that we mean the shortages that have been experienced in the last few years, are real because we have passed the peak of production of oil in the United States. The peak has, the amount of oil that could be found has declined because we're running out of oil, and that's why there is a real shortage. Now, I don't believe that's true, and let me say why. The amount of oil found in the United States each year has dropped rapidly since about 1957. Now, there could be two reasons. One is the reason that Dr. Hubbard proposed, namely that it has become increasingly difficult to find oil because there is less there. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that we are not looking for the oil. I mean, obviously, a very simple way to not find oil is to stop looking. Now, there are measures of the amount of looking that's done, and they're provided by the American Petroleum Institute. For example, the crew months of geophysical crews in the field, the number of exploratory wells drilled. And as it happens, just when the amount of oil found began to fall, and it's now about 25% of what it was in 1957, just at that point, the intensity of exploration also fell and has fallen in parallel. And the fact is, and in fact one of Dr. Hubbard's slides shows that, there has been in the last 20 years or so, 15 years, a constant ratio between the amount of oil found in the United States and the effort to find it. Now that means that it is not more difficult to find, because if we were running out, it would take more and more effort to find the same amount of oil. And so my conclusion is that a factor is involved in this whole thing which has been largely absent in Dr. Hubbard's talk, which dealt with, so to speak, the geological phenomena. All of the stuff that begins with the beginning of those curves involve human decisions. Somebody decided to do something. And that's what I find missing in the whole discussion. The reason why less oil is being found in the United States today is that the oil companies decided not to look as hard as they did before. The reason? Not that they were running out of oil, but because they could make more money by looking for oil in Saudi Arabia. That's what they guessed. They guessed that in the 60s, that if they looked for oil in the Mideast, produced it there, refined it abroad, and sold it, it would be better for their outlook. And their outlook is simply to make money. That's what they're in business for. It turned out that they were brilliantly successful. Absolutely. We now know it because the profit figures that were published at the end of 1973 showed huge historic records of profit with all the big oil companies, and all the profits really came from their activities abroad. The few oil companies that operate only in the United States just about broke even. In other words, what happened was very simple. Starting about 10, 15 years ago, the oil companies stopped looking for oil very much in the United States. They began to find it outside. They produced it outside because it would make more money. They set us up for an oil shortage. And about a year ago, in other words, they set us up for a panic situation. And about a year ago, they pushed the button and began to say, we're going to run out of oil. We're going to run out of oil. Remember those Gulf bleep bleep ads? Country that runs on oil can't afford to run out. Well, what does that mean? It means that they're warning us that there's going to be a problem, and then suddenly there's a problem. And incidentally, I want to point out to you that when there's an embargo of Saudi Arabian oil placed on the United States, the people who administer it are 4 U.S. oil companies, because 4 U.S. oil companies own 75% of the Aramco Oil Company, The other 25% is owned by Saudi Arabia, which is the organization that markets Saudi Arabian oil. And so these oil companies, they must have been talking with the Saudi Arabian government. And among the things they decided was a year ago to double the production of Saudi Arabian oil, so that when the embargo was imposed, it was imposed on a doubled oil production. And that's why, as you now notice in the papers, we are suddenly discovering that there was no shortage of oil at all in the United States during the entire panic. The fact of the matter is that on February 1st, 1974, we had as much oil in this country as we did on February 1st, 1973. And yet, friends of mine on the East Coast were standing 3 hours in line waiting for gasoline. In Des Moines, you did not. In St. Louis, we did not. Well, what does that mean? It means that we weren't distributing the oil that we had in an even fashion. And again, this is the oil companies at fault. So I just want to return to the subject that we're interested in to say that the recent oil crisis is a consequence of the oil companies doing business in order to maximize profit rather than provide the country with the energy that it needs. Yes, we will run out of oil in 20 or 30 or 50 years, and that being the case, it's ridiculous for us to allow our fate as a country to rest on the whim of a few people who happen to control the production of oil.
Every program has its little problems. One of our problems is that one of our afternoon guests, Dr. O'Toole, has been in North Carolina this morning, and he's got his briefcase with him. Now I can't find his briefcase. Will people sort of look around their feet and see if they see a briefcase that doesn't belong to them? There is a lost, straight, and stolen briefcase found. Thank you so much. Excuse me for grabbing the microphone on me. Would you like to respond to Dr. Connolly?
Back in 1961 and 62, in fact, in March the 4th, 1961, President Kennedy addressed a letter to the National Academy of Sciences requesting the Academy to establish an advisory committee to advise him on problems with natural resources. I happened to be a member of that committee, and I was also at the time a research scientist with the Shell Development Company. And I wound up in charge of the energy study for the committee. I wrote a book-sized report on this for the president at the time, and I showed you many slides from that today. One of the problems that was faced by that committee and in the report writing stage was how to present this kind of information to the president and beyond him to the government and to the public. If you quoted expert opinion, you could get any opinion you wanted, as I showed you on that slide, within a range of about fourfold. And by the usual legal rules of expert witnesses, they were all equally expert. So I asked what I think was a very fundamental question. Did they want opinions or did they want evidence? I was told they wanted evidence. And so this report is based on the evidence publicly available, and the conclusions are drawn from that evidence. And that was that the United States was going to reach its peak of oil production near the end of the 1960 decade because oil is getting more and more difficult to discover. Now, the really clinching evidence is not in this report, but was a study made later, and that is the oil found per foot, that drastic decline from a peak of 300 barrels per foot, which included the accidental discovery of the Big East Texas oil field by an old-time wildcatter. That decline from the 30s up to now, that's 35 years or so, of the period of the most intense research and development in the methods of finding and producing oil in the history of the petroleum industry. Those figures in there was the composite achievement of the oil industry technically. Now, these are, you see, the oil found per year is the kind of thing that Dr. Comner talks about. I mean, if you drill more wells, presumably you'll find more oil. That's a decision made by corporate officials. The oil found per foot doesn't rest on any such consideration. It is the best the technical men of the oil industry have been able to do during this period. And there was a drop from 300 barrels per foot down to about 30 barrels per foot in approximately 40 years. Now, this has been going on approximately since the beginning of the oil industry. To be sure, there's aberration, there's a low point and a high point, but on the average, this decline of oil found per foot has been going on throughout the whole history. And there's no big boss that can bang the table and tell the engineering staff or the exploration staff to go out and double it. It cannot be done. Now, again, as to when did this actual decline in discovery take place, one has to be aware of the statistics because one has to, whatever statistics he's using, he has to consider very carefully what they mean. Now, what I call proved discoveries is a kind of it's a statistic that is by definition made up of the oil already produced up to now plus the proved reserves. Now, the proved reserves is not an estimate of how much oil there is in the fields that have already been discovered. This is an incremental thing that is added annually by extensions and revisions, new discoveries plus extensions and revisions. Now, actually, for actual history of discovery, it is better to attribute the oil to the year the field was discovered. For example, the East Texas field was discovered in 1930. Well, the proved reserves would have been added incrementally with drilling over the next 20 or 25 years. But you can equally well credit the whole East Texas field and all the oil in it to the year 1930 because that's when the field was discovered, and successive drilling, of course, would add the additional oil. But the field was discovered in 1930. So that if we take that kind of a statistic and we credit the fields, all the oil in every field to the year the field was discovered, that peak of discovery occurred in the 5-year period between 1935 and 1940, and it's been declining drastically since that time. So all I'm saying is that these statistics are impersonal. They're not contrived. They're publicly available, and they're subject to analysis and interpretation. And the question of how much oil there is in the ground, I dare say Professor Comner doesn't know any more about that than I do. If we knew where the oil was, we wouldn't drill all those dry holes. I'll give you another significant statistic. There's a committee that's been running since the middle 30s, which publishes about June or July every year, in the Bulletin of the American Association of Petroleum Geologists, a review of the exploratory drilling that's taken place during the preceding year. Now, this committee has one table that they began around 1945, and that is how many new field wildcats, that's the only kind of well that discovers new oil fields, how many new field wildcats does it take each year to make one, what was originally called a profitable discovery, meaning an oil field of 1 million barrels of oil or an equivalent amount of gas or combination. That's about the break-even point. If you find anything smaller than that, chances are it won't pay for the drilling. This statistic began in they allow for 6 years of development before they evaluate. So this year, they will tell you how well we did 6 years ago, nothing more recently. In 1945, the first year this series began, it took 26 new field wildcat wells to make one significant or profitable discovery of oil or gas or a combination. By 1951, let's see, that was 1945, no, 1956. It took 52 new field wildcats to make one profitable discovery. In other words, we had declined almost exactly 50% during that 10-year period. It's now up around 70 new field wildcats to make one profitable discovery. If you take oil alone, 2 years ago, I don't have the figure last year, but 2 years ago it was 111 new field wildcats required to make one significant oil discovery. Now, those are figures publicly available, and they simply indicate that oil is getting very difficult to find in the United States. The hot spots, of course, are the offshore in the Louisiana offshore, for example, is one of the best oil hunting territories in the last 15 or 20 years, and also the temporarily, I think, shut down Santa Barbara Channel on the west coast. But the evidence are thoroughly available to indicate that we are indeed approaching the phasing out or the decline. We are in the decline stage. And if you add the oil already found plus the oil already produced, I would say that we probably have discovered close to 80% of all the oil that will ever be produced in the lower 48 states. Will be from fields that have already been discovered now.
Let me try to clarify what the issue is here. In the last 15 years, the amount of oil found in the United States by American oil companies has declined rapidly, so that we now find less oil each year than we use each year, thereby becoming dependent on outside oil. That's a fact. Now the question that I ask is this: what is the reason for this phenomenon? Is it the fact which everyone acknowledges, that there's a limited amount of oil, and that therefore the decline in the finding of oil is a natural consequence of our running out of it? That's the question. My position is that the decline in the finding of oil is a man-made phenomenon. That is, a corporation-made phenomenon. Now let me go to the data that Dr. Hubbard presented. I've got his graph in front of me, which you saw on the slides. It's a plot horizontally of the cumulative exploratory footage, and vertically the rate of discovery at those different cumulative footages. And as he points out, there was a sharp drop in the rate of discovery per foot of exploratory drilling from the 1920s to the present. But now let's take the phenomenon that I've been talking about, the decline in the discovery of oil. That began around 1957 and has dropped off each year to that point where it's now 25% of what it was in 57. According to this graph, in 1955, there were 3.08, well, we'll call them units, found. At the present time, it is 3.52. The rate of discovery per cumulative foot has been constant over the period of time in which the amount of oil found has fallen off. That means that the physical findability has been constant in that period of time, yet less oil has been found. And this is simply the proof of the point that I've been making. That yes, it is now more difficult to find oil than it was in the 1920s, but in the period since 1957, it has been constantly difficult, and yet the amount of oil found has been falling off. And Dr. Hubbard has given you the answer to that too. He said that the number of dry wells drilled per profitable producing well has gone up. Now, there are two reasons why that may happen. One reason is that the profitability that is demanded by the oil companies has increased. You understand that an oil company will drill here or there, depending on a few percentage points of their guess about the profitability. Now, one reason why oil wells are now less profitable to the oil companies in the United States than they were is that it's more profitable for them to go to Saudi Arabia. And the only point I'm making is the one that he's demonstrated by those data, that the determination of the production of oil in the United States at the present time is not being made by the physical facts of how much oil there is, but by the economic facts of what the oil companies consider their right profit. And the issue that is raised then is, should the country go through the kind of torment that it went through during the last year? You know, we had it easy here in the Midwest. Not all of us. Wait till the price of food goes up in the fall. Ask your farmer friends the difficulties that they're having in finding fertilizer and in propane for grain drying. I have a neighbor near our farm in the Ozarks who stacked wood this winter that he cut in the national forest instead of burning propane. When I asked him why, he said, well, I can't afford to buy it at 3 times the price. In other words, there has been a tremendous burden put on the people of this country, not because oil has been running out, but because the oil companies were not satisfied with the rate of profit that American oil gave them.
I'm going to interrupt by just pointing out some hands. I see a fuzzy-headed fellow back over here. The question addresses itself, and what the hell do we do?
I'd like to go back to 1962. In 1962, the evidence on this question was to me crystal clear that we were going to be where we are now at just about this time. That was what I attempted to tell the President of the United States, and beyond him, the government and the public, that we had better start getting ready for an oil and gas shortage, which is going to come in about 10 or 15 years from that date, or sooner. Now, the opposing views, I think they're not too different from Dr. Commoner's, which were present at that time, was that we had huge quantities of oil, the order of 4 times as much as I would be willing to allow, or 3 to 4 times as much, and therefore we could coast until maybe around 1980 or 90, or toward the end of the century. There was some little argument over this point at the time.
That's not my position. I agree with the limit in the amount of oil, okay? What I say is that the decline in production is being governed by the profit situation of the oil companies. I just don't want my position misread.
I'm predicting, throughout this, there is no dollars in any of my analyses.
Well, there are.
This is a technological problem, as far as I'm concerned, and on the basis of the technological information available, and abundantly available in 1962, this report accurately predicted that we were going to be here at just about this time. I'm the only man in the United States that made such a prediction. The opponents put this situation off to near the end of the century. This opinion was not taken seriously. If you want to know when the energy crisis happened, I can name it almost to the day. It happened the day the proved reserve report of the American Petroleum Institute and the American Gas Association was issued, which was just about this time of the year in 1969. What that report showed was that proved reserves of natural gas, which had been steadily climbing for decades, from one year to the next, had dropped 5 trillion cubic feet by the end of 1968 with respect to the end of 1967. That is when the energy crisis happened. Oh my God, we've got an energy crisis.
And it happened for a dollar reason, because in 1968 the Supreme Court upheld the cutback on the depletion allowance. And everyone knows that immediately the oil companies stopped pumping looking for oil. The dollars are what count.
I might give you another dollar explanation. In about 1938, the Supreme Court made a decision that the Federal Power Commission should be the administrator of the international distribution of gas, largely at the instigation of the public utilities of the public utility commissions of the northern states. I'm not saying that that's good or bad, I'm stating a fact. The consequence of that was that the Federal Power Commission set itself up and regarded itself, I think quite properly, as the protector of the consuming interest in the distribution of gas. And that took the form of rate regulations based on their previous experience with the power rate regulation. And that was that we wanted to keep the price of gas just as low as possible for the benefit of the consumer. Now, who did the consumer turn out to be? The power companies. The power companies could buy energy from that good, clean, natural gas. At half the price, they could buy coal, or nasty coal, or dirty oil. And so what? Well, of course, they bought natural gas. And consequently, we've come to a natural gas shortage because of the price of natural gas much quicker, or considerably quicker, than we would have otherwise. I'm not saying good, bad, or indifferent. I'm saying that's what happened.
Well, let me try to answer the question, what do we do? The point that I've been trying to make is that the governance of the use of the vital energy resource is in the economic realm. We have been forced to do various things because of the profit motive governing what the oil companies do. Now, I think that's a fact. This immediately raises the question as to whether it makes sense socially for this country to depend on something as vital and as essential as energy, have it governed by a mechanism which will be turned on and off depending on a few percentage points in the profit rate. For example, you all know that now the oil companies, they're telling us that in the ads, they're going back to the wells and getting more oil out. The reason why they're doing it, of course, is that we're all paying higher prices for gasoline. In other words, what this says, and Mr. Simon has said this over and over again, the oil companies will produce oil if it pays them. If it pays them to produce fuel oil, they'll do it. And we'll let the fuel oil price rise on the East Coast to get them to produce more fuel. So a basic question that the country faces is, shall we govern the use of oil and gasoline and so on by this economic mechanism, or is it not working very well? Now, my answer, I think, is that it's not working well, and I think it's time to face the question of taking this resource, which incidentally mostly belongs to the people of the country, because a good deal of it is under public lands now. The question is, shall we govern the use of this resource socially, or turn its governance, or leave its governance in the hands of private entrepreneurs? And now I can give you an answer which is just one vote among the voters of this country. I think that we will go into a total state of chaos if we continue to allow this resource to be governed by private interests. I think that we've got to take total control of the use of energy in this country in the hands of the people of the country. That means nationalizing.
I'm politically neutral. First we chose one, and the last now one in the right.
Dr. Hubbard, it seems to me, discussion so far, that for the most part, you and Dr.
question, as I understand it, is addressed to Dr. Hubbard, and is specifically, what role did the oil companies play in creating a condition of fuel shortage?
I would say that I am personally uninformed on that subject. I certainly know the prices were drastically increased, beginning with the Saudi Arabians, and from testimony that I've read from oil officials, I think before congressional committees, it certainly wasn't unprofitable to the oil companies to agree with these very large price increases that the Saudi Arabians imposed. It is also true that the reports of the National Petroleum Council of about 3 or 4 years ago to the Secretary of the Interior. Did this mic go off? To the Secretary of the Interior. There were a series of reports about 3 or 4 years ago. And they made very strong recommendations. We, the oil industry, are the only people that can find it for you. But we have to have incentives. Incentives spelled with a dollar sign, and they're spelled out in more detail. Price increases, keep out foreign imports, tax adjustments, tax allowances, etc. Now, I was very interested in that argument in the light of my own information otherwise. First place, I have no evidence whatever that will support the contention of the oil industry that they have huge undiscovered supplies of oil and gas in the lower 48 states. To leave Alaska out is virtually virgin territory for separate discussion. That most of the oil in the United States and gas has already been discovered from all the evidence with which I'm familiar. But let's look at the dollar argument that they put forward that I've just briefly recited. Now, if they can get these financial allowances based on these claims, it doesn't make the slightest bit of difference whether they ever find any more oil or not. They've already jumped their holdings of proved reserves by $100 billion or more even if they got $1 a barrel and an equivalent increase in natural gas, they have in effect increased their financial holdings in the already discovered oil and gas by approximately $100 billion. All the rest I regard as window dressing.
Let me just make one remark. I've got a plot of the cost of crude oil and refined products over the last 2 years. The cost was constant for several years until January of 1973. Before the Arab oil embargo, it rose from January 73 until the embargo of September by 30%. Now, that was the oil companies doing what? Responding to the Arab embargo? Not a bit. They were responding to their own propaganda that they had put out in ads that we were running out of oil. And I think that that's a completely unconscionable act.
Gentlemen, yes.
Both of you men are academicians in the sense, that is, you're probably knowledgeable regarding this problem. Now, I ask, instead of traveling around the country, either individually or as a team, creating most likely a polarized effect on the topic regarding the audience, why can't you two men work out an accountable program to approach those in power and position to solve the problem?
Well, that's a very interesting question. You ask us to approach those in power and solve the problem. What do you think I'm doing right here? You are supposed to be in power, and I'm approaching you, right? The trouble in this country, and I'm not speaking as an academician now, I'm speaking as one voter among many. The trouble in this country, and we all know it now, is that we have allowed the power to go into very few hands. And one reason is that they control the information. And the most effective way in this country to foster the democracy to save it is for those of us who have information that the public needs to get out there and give it to the public.
I would like to supplement the remarks of Dr. Commoner. In fact, he beat me to it. What I was about to say was that the most important thing that I think can happen in this country is a development of a public understanding of the situation that we're in. Now, up until about 5 years ago, incidentally, I've been talking to public audiences on this subject longer than most people, literally for more than 25 years. And universities, professional groups, and miscellaneous public audiences. The public response and interest has been mostly negative until about 5 years ago. Interested, yes, but not convinced. The turnaround, a very markedly one, in my subjective interpretation of the people I've talked to, happened about that time, and it essentially was a transition. I can't tell you why that date and so on. I think it was just a whole combination of things that were closing in on us. And that was a sense that the status quo that we had been accustomed to was somehow or other running out, that we were about the end of an era. And I find this change of attitude independent of any group or class of people. The people I've dealt with are principally audiences such as you, which are what you might call the people of higher levels of education. I have not talked very much with people on the labor forces and so on. But this is true. It's going on in the government. It's going on in universities. It's going on in professional societies. And it's going on in the head offices of corporations. There's a soul-searching attitude, a thoughtful, serious inquiry. Whereas before 5 years ago, they knew all the answers. Now they don't. One of the most, on this 9 weeks lecture tour that I finished recently, one of the most interesting audiences that I talked to was an audience about the size of this in New York City, which was was dominantly the big financial group of New York City. That was the headquarters of the major oil companies, the big banks, and many other lesser financial people. But the attitude was not one of knowing all the answers or being argumentative. The attitude was a thoughtful one of what are the facts of the situation and what are we going to do about it? What can we do about it? That kind of thing.
For a college professor, I'll restrain myself markedly. We are drawing to the close of this particular hour, and I would like to make a very brief remark or two. We've been dealing with a very complex problem, and we've been dealing with it in some regards with a very short-range point of view, what caused it now, a very long-range point of view, what's going to be the set of problems faced in the future. We've been dealing with it both as a technological problem and as an institutional or social problem, and we have discovered, I hope, that the answers are not simple. As this problem applies to the Iowa region, to the middle part of the United States, we have structured for this afternoon in Meredith 101 a continuation of a discussion of this type. The primary discussants will be people drawn from the Midwest. Many of them drawn from Iowa. They will include such persons as people in power, regulators of energy sources. They will include people in power, representatives of Standard Oil of Indiana. They will include representatives of major user groups, such as agriculture in this state. Informed opinions, such as Professor O'Toole and what the hell Sam Tuttle will be here. let me urge that if you're really interested in continuing with this, that you come to the meeting in Meredith 101 at 2:30, and we will now stand adjourned.
Thank you.
Just a second, let me...